All right, this brings us to part 4, I think, which is the actual expansion of the United States. We had just gone over the political expansion. I'll get to the Turner myth perhaps another time. And we go to the actual expansion, which is, as was mentioned earlier, non-linear, and it took place in fits and spurts. So we can get to that in a second. Oof. And so, first of all, there were some complications. We mentioned slavery, and the South really envisioned a cotton kingdom. And the South was very different from the North. It was different from the North socially because they had like hierarchy to their social life, with the planters being on top and the plain folk were poor white people, and then the slaves at the bottom. And so they were different geographically, in that their land was very fertile and they had a longer growing season. This is called sectionalism, by the way. Sectionalism, in how the different parts of the country were profoundly different. They were also different economically. The North was moving towards factory systems, and the South was remaining agricultural. And so the backbone of this way of life was slavery. And this brings us to a really technical issue, which was the existence of slavery. Existence of slavery depended on the Senate. The U.S. Senate it depended on. And so there were a lot of small states in the North. Well, if you remember, in the Senate, every state gets equal representation in the Senate. 2 senators. So you can be California and have 2 senators with 56 million people, and you can be some state like Idaho with 500,000 people and have 2 senators. That is really crazy if you think about it, but it does protect the small states from being overwhelmed by the big ones. 1 in every 8 Americans lives in California today. So, if you were going to get rid of slavery, or if you were going to protect slavery, you were going to do so in the Senate. And believe it or not, there was a balance of slave states versus free states in the Senate. So they were never willing. It was 50-50. 50% versus 50%. It was a miracle. Not a good miracle, though, because it forced them not to come to a compromise or a solution about slavery, which is going to be our Unit 2, the Civil War. And so whenever you wanted, the South was desperate. The South wanted to add states. To protect slavery. And they were interested very early on. Some crazy ones were, some of them had a phrase during the Mexican-American War. The phrase was, all Mexico. Let's not just take over California, let's take over all Mexico. Another one was this thing called, this is getting technical here, but the Ostend Manifesto, which was a bid to purchase Cuba, secretly purchase Cuba, which would have been great because they produced sugar on Cuba, a wicked labor-intensive crop that required slaves. So the South was always the South was very motivated to expand west because they always wanted to gain the upper hand in the Senate and have more slave states. Meanwhile, of course, the North, I don't think the North was against slavery necessarily, but they were against the expansion of slavery. That was a line that the North was willing to hold. The North was benefiting heavily from these southern states because they were producing so much cotton, and that produced all the mills. Like New England was producing tons and tons of cloth. That's what they were doing up in Lowell and Willimantic, Connecticut, all over the place. These cloth factories. So the North was benefiting from slavery. The North was also had been transporting slaves across the Atlantic in the Atlantic slave trade. So there's a book called Complicity about the Northern role in the slave trade. Second motivation, because that's what we're on here, of why people went west was for land. And so New England was filling up. You could have a farm of 140 acres, let's say, but these families were having 10 kids. And so very quickly, these farms were getting way too small for inheritance. And the kids needed, if they were going to farm, they were going to go west. Part of the idea, as was previously mentioned, was Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic. A nation that was of representatives in government, and those representatives would be of farmers. Jefferson hated cities, and he hated businessmen, and he hated northern factories. He thought they were polluted. He thought that there was pollution. That wasn't his big one. Lack of equality. He thought it was sort of like dumb work, working in a factory. It was bad for people, bad for the soul, let's say. Now, these are my words, not his, but you get the idea. He didn't think that a future American economy based on factories was in anybody's good interest. And then finally, of course, is gold. Doesn't get any more simple than that. And that, of course, took place in the California gold rush of the late 1840s, but the 49ers, as well as like in the Dakotas. And then there's the Denver Nuggets, of course, the basketball team. So there was a Colorado gold rush. And these would cause just this massive influx of people who would destroy the land and, pillage it for whatever gold that they could pan for. Which brings us to who went west. And there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this. But first of all, there's like nations. We have to think about who was there. And it wasn't just Americans. Of course, Native Americans were always there. They called it home. And then we had the English, who were racing across Canada. And then we had the Mexicans. And we could even say, and the Spanish at a time before Mexico was separate. And they were coming, let's say, up from the south. And the English were coming down from the north, and the Native Americans were not coming from anywhere, and the Americans were coming west. And believe it or not, and it's not that big in influence, but the Russians and Chinese, not the country of China, but Chinese immigrants were making claims to their east. So this was a large free-for-all, and a good argument can be made, well, if the United States didn't conquer the West, somebody else would have, and it wouldn't have been pretty either. So this was sort of an ugly free-for-all taking place in the western United States, and the United States was in an ugly business, but better be an ugly business and come out on top, I suppose, than an ugly business and come out on the bottom. I don't actually fully agree with that. I'm just saying that that case could be made. So we can take a look at the nations that were competing for the American West, but we can also look at the citizens who were coming west. And we largely, as was already mentioned, non-landholding men were one. There were large numbers of women with absolutely remarkable stories, so we should tell that. Sometimes they were going alone, I believe, or in groups of women. It was really fascinating. I had already mentioned Mexican and Mexicanos. We're not going to go there for now, but we will in 5th grade. And then we have slaves. Slaves were brought west in what were called these chain gangs called coffers. Oh no, I think it was called coffles. We'll look that up, but it's really close to that. And then, of course, freedmen went west, and that was in the post-Civil War period. I had already gone over the English and the Chinese, Native Americans, were all the nations that went west. We can ask, when did they go? Now we're sort of hopping around really quickly here, but it starts, of course, in the 1780s, but at that time it's Ohio. The West is in Ohio. And then Lewis and Clark, that's going to be a heavy focus. They sort of open up the West, and that's the opening salvo, where the westward mythology is first started. They open up the West with their expedition sent by Thomas Jefferson. I had already gone over Ohio. It starts with Ohio. That date is wrong. And then the Texas, we talked about the Anglos earlier. And then annexation. And then in the West Coast, the 1840s and 50s, we mentioned the 49ers. We didn't mention the Oregon Trail. And we can go into the 1860s with the Homestead Act, as well as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1863. So it's interesting that just because the Civil War was on, it didn't mean that westward expansion stopped. It's really fascinating what was happening out west while the country was being torn into two. So this is largely Lewis and Clark right through here. This is going to be the focus of our class quite heavily this year. And finally, post-1865, that's an area that we need to build up a little bit because we don't tell the story. Well, we have in the past of this tribe called the Nez Perce, which was an earlier tribe that had contact with Lewis and Clark and then was later pushed off their land. But then we also have an insanely ugly treatment of Native Americans and the Battle of Wounded Knee, and it wasn't the massacre at Wounded Knee, I should say, and the Battle of Little Bighorn are two of the most famous. But the treatment of Native Americans is absolutely horrendous. That's going to need to find its way in. And then, interestingly, we're familiar with the Bob Marley song Buffalo Soldiers in the Heart of America. They were stolen from Africa and brought to America. And so Buffalo Soldiers represent the black soldiers in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. And then after the war was over, the United States took that Northern Army and turned it west to conquer the Native Americans. All right, that's a lot. So we're going to stop there, and next up is I'll have some lessons for you in a day-by-day grid that will allow us to start to tackle some of this information in a logical way for our kids. All right, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.